Hi there. The following is a video explanation of the New England colonies formed by the Pilgrims and the Puritans. If we look at a map, here is the location where the Puritans and the Pilgrims settled. You recognize this as the state of Massachusetts today, but the Pilgrims are going to form the Plymouth colony, and then about a decade later, the Puritans would settle farther north in what they called the Massachusetts Bay colony. On a map of the 13 colonies a century later, you can see that the area where the Pilgrims and the Puritans settled is the region in the colonies known as New England. Okay, so let's talk about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a religious group who wanted to break away from the Church of England, where they could worship freely the way that they hoped to practice it. And at the time, that was not allowed. So the Church of England, as it is today, was the official church in England. The head of the Church of England being the king or the queen, whoever happened to be ruling at the time. And so in this case, it was King James. And the Pilgrims, not wanting to worship as the Church of England required them to, they resorted to breaking away entirely, illegally. So they needed to leave England entirely so that they could practice as they wished. So they talked to the Virginia Company and were given permission to settle within Virginia Company land in North America. They wanted to create a distinct body by themselves where they could independently worship as a community the way that they hoped to. And so they set sail in 1620. So this is 13 years after the Jamestown colony was founded, aboard the very famous ship, the Mayflower, and they arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And you might notice there's a problem here because the Virginia Company had given them the authority to settle within Virginia Company land, and clearly they did not end up there. So they ran into some bad weather and some navigational issues. And so when they settled in far north of Virginia Company territory, the agreement that the Pilgrims had made with the Virginia Company no longer applied. So they were kind of outside the territory that they were supposed to be in, where their agreement didn't really matter anymore. So the men aboard the Mayflower signed together this document that they created called the Mayflower Compact, which is essentially an agreement to obey laws that will support the good of the group rather than just one specific individual. So they're creating what's called a civil body politic that would give the men of this settlement the right to vote on issues together. Women were not allowed to participate in these discussions at this point. This was only for the men, but this is one of those early examples of sort of democracy being formed by the individuals who settled in North America. Now, the Pilgrims didn't have an easy go of it, very similar to the Roanoke colonists and the Jamestown colonists before them. They really struggled in those first winters. So more than half of the Pilgrims died in their first winter in Plymouth. They really made it through with the help of Native Americans, and even though those relationships were not always perfect, in fact, they went to war with each other about 50 years after first settling, the most famous being King Philip's War. The relationship between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims is really the only reason that the Pilgrims were able to survive. So think about the famous legendary stories of Thanksgiving. Okay, so that was the Pilgrims. Now the Puritans. The Puritans were similar to the Pilgrims in that they were a religious group. They had belonged to the Church of England, but one of the key differences is that the Puritans didn't want to break away from the Church of England. They wanted to purify it, hence the name Puritans. So they wanted to remain a part of the Church of England. They just wanted to fix and improve it. So they headed for Massachusetts, intentionally for Massachusetts, in 1630, a decade after the Pilgrims had gotten there. And the colony that they created was on behalf of the Massachusetts Bay Company. So similar to the Virginia Company claiming land, now the Puritans are doing it. But their motivation is much more religious. So they wanted to be a city upon a hill. That was the phrase that they used, kind of a shining light, a perfect example for the rest of the world to show here's how we should live out our faith, here's how we should work together and live as a community. And so they wanted to be this kind of perfect, pure, shining light to show the world how life should be done best. That meant, though, that the Puritans were very, very strict about their religious practices and about life within their colony. So they had strict laws requiring church attendance, requiring hard work. If you missed church, which was frequent and very long, you had to pay a fine. Children were required by law to learn how to read so that they could read the Bible. And their important decisions were made by the ministers, by the church leaders. So the religious leaders were the ones who were running this colony for the Puritans. People who disagreed were oftentimes banished, sent out of the colony entirely. So the famous example being Anne Hutchinson, who was forced to leave the Massachusetts Bay Colony entirely because she disagreed with the ministers who were leading their colony. So this is just a recap of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, some of their similarities and differences. Hope this helped you understand a bit more. Thanks for watching.